Rob Tebbutt here for Boxing News. Delighted to be joined by Stephen Espinoza. We are here in Las Vegas, Nevada, ahead of Errol Spence versus Terence Crawford. Stephen, thanks very much for giving us your time. How are you?
I'm relatively relaxed given where we are in the week.
Is that normal for you to be?
It isn't, but look, one of the interesting things that we did on this event, because there were some special considerations. We had a lot of these agreements done in advance, and in fact, before we announced the fight, we had done all the agreements: the venue agreement, all the pay-per-view distribution agreements. That's something that usually comes later. You sign the main fight agreement and then fill in all the other agreements. But because there were a lot of approvals and a lot of careful negotiating, all those agreements got done 10 weeks ago. So here I am, fight week, relatively relaxed.
How does this fight compare to some of the other big fights that you mentioned, which we'll come on to talk about in the interview? But this is a fight that we've all been waiting many, many years for. It's finally here. Describe, if you can, the journey to get here for Spence-Crawford.
Well, in terms of the fight itself, I think hesitate to compare anything to Mayweather-Pacquiao because it's an outlier in every single respect. But in terms of fights that there was demand and anticipation and expectation that'd be made, I'd put this up there in that category. I mean, people have been pining for it and complaining about it and wishing for it and cursing about it for quite a while. So it's a relief to be able to deliver that to the industry. It's also, as a boxing fan, it's exciting. Obviously, I mean, this is truly a fight fan's dream fight. It doesn't get any better than this.
We've seen both Errol Spence and Terence Crawford talk quite openly about, having a conversation and having a FaceTime, and ultimately that, going some way to getting the fight done. What's your understanding of that, and from your perspective, getting the deal done? How difficult, how easy a process was that?
It was pretty difficult. Again, I wouldn't put it in Mayweather-Pacquiao territory quite yet, but it was, at least in terms of the negotiation process, it was as complex and as lengthy as any that I've been involved in. Certainly, fights like Mayweather-Pacquiao and Davis-Garcia were a little bit more complicated in terms of the operation and how you actually carried out the promotion, because you had partners and collaborators there, which we didn't hear. But in terms of the negotiation itself, this was as lengthy and time-consuming and as difficult and challenging as any that I've been involved in. But there were points at which point Terence said to PBC and TGB, because he was involved very much so from the start. So that's one unique aspect of it. He was far more involved than I think just about any fighter that I can recall in any negotiation I've been aware of. But there came some points where we were at an impasse, and Crawford's response to us was, well, let me just get on the phone with Errol, and we'll talk it out man to man. And everyone checked with Errol. He said, sure, no problem. So, as unorthodox as it is, that's what happened. They got on the phone with each other. I don't think anybody was on except for them two. So I heard what was said, but no one really witnessed it. I think Errol said it was, at least one of them was about a half hour long. And then coming out of that, regardless how it got done, they told us the resolution. And it was some fairly significant points, some real basic foundational deal points like financial splits, like how the rematch works. Those were things that they got on the phone and resolved among themselves.
In your position as somebody who, in a high-ranking executive at Showtime, does that, from my perspective, obviously in a much smaller business, that would kind of freak me out a little bit. Not giving the power to the fighters, but not being involved in quite significant points to making a fight. How did you feel about that?
Look, there was a little bit of risk because you never want them to come back with something completely unorthodox that they just created out of whole cloth, and something that we have to disappoint them and say, I'm sorry, that resolution doesn't actually work for everyone else. But these guys have been around the block. They're pretty specific points. I didn't think the risk of that was that high. And at the end of the day, it's their payday, it's their legacy. They're the ones who are going to have to live with this deal. So at a certain point, they're both smart enough and experienced enough to know what they're talking about. So, why not let them negotiate their own deal, at least in that certain respect?
You mentioned earlier about Gervonta Davis versus Ryan Garcia, a huge event, not just a huge fight. You followed this quite quickly on the heels of that. Where does this lie with regards to, I'm guessing more talking about the commercial side of the fight, where do you feel like that ranks with Gervonta Davis and Ryan Garcia?
Well, look, Davis Garcia was a bit of a surprise. I mean, we knew it would be big, but we hadn't seen anything hit 1 million buys in the U.S. since Canelo Golovkin about 5 years ago. So not saying that we had written off the hope of reaching 1 million, but it was, it was something that was optimistic. We thought we were very high six figures. So it probably outperformed by, 20, 25% what we thought it would do. But that was, you could, in retrospect, look and say, look, there's two huge social fan bases, two young demographics, two guys who are, bring in casual fans to the sport. So in a certain point, it makes sense. Those guys came in, Davis and Garcia came in with a lot of non-boxing fans in their fan base. This is more a fight fans fight, so the goal here really is to expand that base. We were already starting with a broad base on Davis Garcia. On Spence-Crawford, the hope was that we would take the enthusiasm, the excitement that the boxing fan had for it, and help spread and carry that over. And I think it's working. I mean, certainly, if we look at the ticket sales, as of today, Wednesday afternoon, there's a couple hundred seats left. It's going to be a gate that's in the range of Davis Garcia. We don't really know that much about pay-per-views. I mean, we've got a couple thousand buys, which, you can microanalyze that and say, well, it's 10% higher than this fight or 30% higher than that fight. But based on 2,000 buys, you can't extrapolate that much. So we've got to look at other stuff, the gate. We've got to look at social media traffic. We talk to guys like you, both in the UK and in the US, and saying, look, how much traction are your articles getting? What kind of clicks? What kind of views are the All Access episodes doing? I mean, all of those say that we're in very, very good shape. I'm not saying it'll exceed Davis Garcia, but it'll be as big as anything else short of that this year.
Something you've just kind of touched on there, which is where I was going with it, really. Did Davis Garcia, and being such a massive success, did that, to use a British term, give the rest of boxing a bit of a kick up the arse, going, make this fight? I mean, of course, this is a fight that's been talked about for many, many years anyway, and we would have all been calling for it regardless of Davis Garcia, but did that just help a little bit?
I think, excuse me, sorry for that. Maybe, but not quite in the same way. I think it's more of a competitive aspect. And it's one thing to, sit either in the audience or sit at home and see a big event, see a lot of excitement and say, look, I want to be the center of that storm. I want to be doing that. I want to be the center of attention. I want to be putting on those big events. And I think that's what has happened. And I think it's a series of events, because if we go back, Benavidez Plant, then, Ryan and Tank, and then this one. And I don't think it's a coincidence that once you get that snowball rolling, that it gathers steam. Because nobody wants to be the fighter that breaks the streak, because it's going to stick out like a sore thumb. If a high-level fighter is taking a secondary, call it tune-up fight, whatever terminology you want to use, at this point, it's going to stick out like a sore thumb, because these are massive, massive fights, the toughest. I mean, in either fights that are off our network, Stephen Fulton doing what he just did. I mean, we are in an era, and I'm never really subscribed to the sort of tired criticism that boxing can't make big fights. I think that changed years ago. You might have been able to say it 10 years ago, but if you look really closely, the last 4 or 5 years, excluding, of course, COVID, there has been, with regularity, a lot of big fights getting made. You can go back and look at Wilder Fury. We didn't know that would turn into a trilogy, but it certainly was one of those fights that seemed at the time that it needed to happen, and it got done relatively quickly. So I think, from there, you can look at Jamal Charlo becoming undisputed, Spence becoming unified, Canelo becoming undisputed. You can't get unified and undisputed champions unless the best are fighting the best. And we have more undisputed champions right now than we have at any point in history. So I think if you look at it, and like you said, these are happening with regularity, and they tend to build upon themselves and snowball.
Mentioned Benavidez Plant, and of course Gervonta Davis versus Ryan Garcia. We're here for Crawford Spence. Canelo Alvarez returns to Showtime against Jermell Charlo in September. Having a pretty good year, Stephen, on Showtime Boxing. It seems as though you are, I don't want to say flavour of the month, as we know boxing can be a very fickle sport, but seems to be a good place, Showtime Boxing at the minute.
It's been a fantastic year, and there's a lot of theories about why everything has come together this year, and look, would have loved to have done all these fights last year or the year before, and we tried. So sometimes it's a little bit of luck, it's a little bit of happenstance, but we're always trying to make these fights. We tried to make Ryan and Tank a couple times before it got made. Very publicly, Spence-Crawford got crushed last fall, and everyone else was crushed in response, but we're able to pick up the pieces and put it back together again. So look, I've said I've experienced both ends of the spectrum. There are some points in my career where people are saying he's the best executive we've had, and there are other times in my career where they're saying I'm the worst there's ever been. Now neither is true. It's somewhere in the middle, but right now look, we're pretty happy with the programming we're putting out there.
But as I say, boxing can be a fickle sport, and it's a very extreme sport. You're either, as you say, the best or the worst. Mentioned to you briefly before we got started, I'd like to just run through a few little bits and pieces from your career, and just kind of get to know you a little bit more, I think, Stephen. And I was going to say it's the first time we've done an interview, but we have actually done one previously after you were in 3 cities in 3 days, and the last time I saw you was before Mayweather-McGregor in London.
Yeah, I'm not sure that was a fair representation. There was a lot going on.
There was indeed. Lee Steinberg, somebody that you worked with many, many years ago, somebody who was, kind of in pop culture for a period of time as the real life Jerry Maguire, so to speak. What was it like working with him?
It was fantastic, and I was actually there when Cameron Crowe was following Lee around, writing the movie or collecting information, and no one really paid him attention. He was sort of this. All the agents sort of looked at him as sort of this nerdy little writer who's working on something. Nobody thought, oh, this is going to end up as a Tom Cruise movie. But it was a fantastic experience. Lee sort of invented, at least in the U.S., the big American football sports agent. And really at that point had every major quarterback. He had a who's who. And that's really where I got my start negotiating, and representing talent. And it's funny, at the time, we crossed briefly. Lee was representing Oscar De La Hoya. And I went to a couple meetings, wasn't doing a lot. And so there wasn't a lot of involvement, but obviously our paths would cross yet again a little bit later in life after I had gone to law school and graduated.
What was it like working with Lee on a day-to-day? What type of person was he? As I understand it, quite a colourful character at times. He has, of course, since reinvented himself in recent years. What was he like to work with?
One of the smartest people that I've ever met. And just at some points, somewhat difficult to relate to because he is that smart. But when he's in sales mode in a room and turns on the charm, you can see it, and he's one of those, when the lights are on, he delivers. He's a clutch player. Around the office, he can be sort of bookish and really intelligent, a little bit introverted. You get him in the room with a college kid and he turns into the world's best salesman. So I think there's a couple things I took away from that. One, the power of charisma and personality. And his ability to sort of turn it off and on when he needed it. But probably even more importantly was the preparation. He had always said that every negotiation is won or lost before it's even really started. And he was freakish about preparing for negotiation. And that was, as a young employee, really an intern at that point, that was my part, was to, arm him and the other agents when they went into negotiation with every conceivable piece of information that might be relevant, every argument, every potential deal structure, all of that, so that nothing could be a surprise once you got in there. So I think that's something that I think has served me well. I mean, taking that approach and applying it wherever I've gone in business.
Is that what type of negotiator you are? Are you in that mold?
I hope. I hope that's what kind of negotiation. I mean, look, I can't say that I'm prepared for every eventuality in this sport. I don't think anybody could possibly be. But I think, as a general model, I do subscribe to that theory that, a lot of this is won and lost in terms of preparation, and that is often the deciding factor.
Now, before you kind of, I guess, dove into boxing with both feet, you worked with a who's who of entertainers. One entertainer I'm quite interested to speak to you about is Snoop Dogg. What was it like working with him?
It's about what you would think. He's look. Every meeting was always in a smoky room. That's not a cliche. That was the truth. What you see is what you get with him. But he's also, and I've been fortunate to work with several people like this, intuitively understood marketing and their audience. And you can see with Snoop, for someone to remain relevant, to start as a rapper essentially, and to become sort of a cultural figure, not regularly making music anymore. He does, dabble in it, but he's still as much of a cultural figure as he was literally 30 years ago. So that tells you that this person understands culture, understands marketing, understands staying relevant. And it's not because he went and got an MBA. It's not because he's read marketing books. He just intuitively understands connecting with the audience, with his demographic, with where societal trends are. And he has managed to stay relevant, far beyond, I think, anywhere anyone would have predicted.
Any story? Any one memory that sticks out?
There was one time I visited him on set. He was doing there were several times, but one that sticks out. He was shooting a movie called High School that he did with Wiz Khalifa, that they were actually shooting in an actual high school up in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. So I forget, I had something for him to sign or something to discuss. So I went out there while he was shooting and, sat down in the trailer. And again, would have been the smokiest meeting that we ever had. I'm not sure how coherent I was by the time we actually got around to talking business and he needed to sign. But I just remember leaving home, leaving the set after being there for, 2 or 3 hours. And this, of course, is, late 90s, early 2000s, far before legalization of cannabis anywhere, at least in the U.S. And I remember, driving home and on the freeway with all 4 windows down, full blast, because I think the last thing I wanted was to get pulled over and just reek, because I knew I reeked of it. I was just, driving 55 miles an hour on the dot with all the windows down for fear of being, jailed and no one believing my story.
Question I like to ask people who've kind of worked across different forms of entertainment. What's more difficult, working with boxers, working with musicians and entertainers?
I would say entertainers, because I have found that, the pure creative types generally like to be pure creative, and they tend to have reps who handle their business. And I'm not saying that it's not good to be involved in their business, certainly they are, but when you are a producer type, or a director that mixes business and creative, it's a different level. When I'm having a conversation with an artist, there are certain things that, are just, sure, you can ask my opinion, but no one's asking me to listen to Snoop's beats, and by extension, like, I think, when I'm telling him an area of my expertise, I'm assuming he's going to, take my advice. He's got his specialty, I have mine. But then there's a lot of entertainers who, tend to dabble in everything and not as successfully, as some. So it's a different level when you are, partners in a negotiation with a client, throughout the process. And sometimes a client who may not be as informed or may have certain misconceptions about it, it's sometimes difficult walking your client through every single step of a negotiation if he's the type that tends to look over your shoulder the whole time. That can be challenging.
Moving into boxing, you alluded to it earlier, meeting Oscar De la Hoya and working with Oscar De la Hoya. What was that like? Obviously, years and years later, we were kind of in the boxing industry now, but do you remember those early years of working with Oscar?
Oh, sure. Like I was as much a fan as anybody. I mean, growing up in a Mexican-American household, he was an icon. There was, Julio Cesar Chavez, at least in our household, and there was Oscar. And, those were really, in terms of, certainly there's other Latino or Mexican-American sports icons on the time, but those two were really the icons, when I was growing up in the late 90s, in particular, when it was just like the Beatles, for Oscar. So I'd seen his fights. I was a fan, and it's the last thing I ever expected that I would be representing him or any boxer for that matter. It wasn't my goal. I was a huge sports fan, but it never occurred to me, let me develop a specialty in representing boxers. It just happened because Oscar had some litigation at the firm I was at, and he wanted to bring in the transactional business. I was a film and television lawyer, so the litigator came down and said, look, we're handling this lawsuit for Oscar. He wants to bring his business into us as well. Here, congratulations, you're now one of Oscar's lawyers. And I think I said at the time, but I don't really know anything about the boxing business. And his response is, well, look, you're a television lawyer. He's on television. You'll figure it out. So it was a little bit of trial by fire. That was shortly before the Trinidad fight. So really going into the peak of his career. And then a few years later, he started Golden Boy Promotions, and I was counsel to that as well. So it was a great learning experience, and it was learning on the job, and from all facets, from the promoter side, from the sponsorship side, from the individual athlete side.
What's your relationship like with Oscar De La Hoya now?
It's not as strong as it once was, to be completely honest. I mean, I think we are still, we're still collegial. We're still friendly. I mean, it's not like we're sending each other hate mail. But, look, there have been, certain business alliances and, certain things that he perceived I was on one side or the other once I became to Showtime that, probably put a strain in the relationship. But we've talked and we're certainly friendly. We worked successfully together on Davis versus Garcia. I'd welcome the opportunity to continue working with him. I'm proud of the work that we did together, both for him individually and for Golden Boy Promotions as a company.
I mean, you've worked in boxing a lot longer than I have, but it seems sort of quite a common theme throughout there. You have these kind of, I don't want to speak for you, but checkered relationships with people that kind of come and go, but if there's business to be done, more often than not, if it makes sense, you get the job done.
Yeah, I've never been, I think there are people who believe, hey, once you're on my bad side, I'm never doing business with you. I mean, look, the reality is I'm in here not to be best friends with everybody I'm doing business with. So I'm not going to foreclose any business opportunity. And, certainly there's no animosity with Oscar. We don't work closely anymore. But if there were opportunities like Davis Garcia or like Munguia Charlo or anything else, like, sure, whatever history there was. I mean, I have a much more difficult history with other figures in boxing, and we're still able to work together. So that's just part of trying to be a mature business person.
What was it like working with Mike Tyson?
Mike's one of my favorite people in the world. Like I used to say this all the time, when I get that question and people looked at me strangely, I said, he's actually very funny. And before The Hangover, no one got that. If you list all the adjectives that people who didn't know Mike Tyson would describe him with, funny would have been bottom of the list. But I think The Hangover changed a lot of perceptions and allowed him, to really embody him, go to his point. And he's another one who's really transitioned from where he's come personally, professionally. And I'm really happy for his success. I mean, and where he's at now, what he's been through, it's a minor miracle. I think he'd be the first to say it.
What period of his career, his life, did you work with him, and what's your relationship now?
Worked with him from 2000 to 2011, so the tail end of his career. I mean, obviously the highlight was Lewis Tyson, and then a string of mostly forgettable fights after that, and then some miscellaneous things after. There was a bankruptcy, there was the lawsuit with Don King, there was The Hangover, some other TV projects. And we're still friendly. Look, I see him at fights. We talk about, DMT and ayahuasca, which he's a huge advocate from. He's probably talked me into it. I think I'll try it at some point. He's a big fan of the toad poison, as he tells everybody. So, I just couldn't be happier for where he is, as a person right now in his life.
Get you on an episode of Hot Boxing with Mike Tyson?
Yeah, I'd love to. I don't know if I'm going to cry. I don't know if I'm going to get high. I think one of those two is a requirement for me on the show. You either got to cry or be high or both.
I was going to say both is probably the most likely in that instance. I think it's fair to say, certainly in a boxing sense, that, again, don't want to put words in your mouth, but your greatest success, a certain Floyd Mayweather Jr., the time that you had him from Showtime, of course you went over to Showtime in 2011. Describe, if you can, working with Floyd Mayweather and how he's really shaped boxing, not just as a fighter, for all of his accolades and for all of his skill, the business side and the influence that he has on the next generation coming through and on yourself.
Yeah, I would argue that he's really shaped the business of sport as much as the business of boxing. I mean, certainly he had a lot of impact in boxing, and to this day, I think a lot of different influences are apparent. But I think he was also at the forefront of a wave of athlete empowerment. You see it all the time, what NBA players are doing, and to a certain extent, even soccer players and others, in terms of taking their own careers into their own hands. And he was really at the forefront of doing that. When he bought himself out of the top-ranked contract, decided to bet on himself, made a late career switch from networks to a better opportunity. Not a lot of people would have done that. And, really self-determined, his own public image, and he was we don't see that as a noteworthy thing today because social media is such a fabric, and, everybody can choose what brand and what part of themselves they show on social media and determine their quote unquote brand. That, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, wasn't as common a thing, but that's certainly the road that he took, and it was more like 15 years ago that he said, I'm going to leave who was arguably the biggest promoter in the sport at the time because I think I can do it better on my own, which is, a courageous thought, but to have the courage to put, 6 figures of your own money behind it to get there, he's a true entrepreneur. And the way I think people misinterpret and misapply a lot of his sort of principles. I think it's easy to sort of look at the massive success and say, okay, what do I take away? The flamboyant personality, the catchphrases, the insistence on being, perfect and undefeated. I think that's one thing that gets mischaracterized a lot. That was a tool, not an end. It was the means, not the end. That was, his pride in being perfect. I mean, certainly was genuine, but it was part of this persona that he created. It wasn't, this is my goal to be perfect. It is, look at me, I am perfect. No one can beat me. I am at the pinnacle of my sport. So I think now he wrongly gets blamed for everyone wants to be perfect. Well, he didn't want to be perfect. If you want to be perfect, you don't take the kinds of risks that he did consistently along the way. Now people can say, like on the Canelo fight, they're like, oh, it was easy. That wasn't apparent before the fight. People were saying, this is the guy. He's bigger, he's younger, he's more athletic. And then afterwards, people are saying, Floyd didn't take any risks. Well, when you're that good, everything looks easy.
You touched upon it there, and kind of I think the cheap and easy line to throw out is, Mayweather's ruined boxing. People only care about their own, and people make out like Duran and Leonard and Hearns and Hagler are jumping in the ring with each other every 3 months for 10 grand.
Right.
How has that influenced fighters that you deal with now, both positively and negatively? Kind of the way that Floyd went about his business.
I think I've yet to meet a fighter that I could specifically say didn't take a fight because they're worried about ruining a perfect record. I guarantee that Stephen Fulton was very proud of being undefeated and having a perfect record. But by the same token, that didn't stop him from challenging himself and going over to Japan and taking on Inoue. So I think both things can be true. You can be proud of being undefeated and yet still willing to risk. So I think people look for an easy solution and an easy bad guy, and Floyd was a bad guy to most people anyway. So when you look at it and say, hey, well, he's the fault, no. First of all, I've never seen a fighter who I sincerely believed was looking to remain perfect and turn down a risk. I think what if there was a negative impact, and it's not anything that Floyd did, I think people see the money and see the ease in which it seemed to be flowing and underestimate the work that it took to get there. And I mean, not just the training and his discipline, which I think is underestimated, but also, the work he did, marketing and behind the scenes. I've never had another fighter who would sit in satellite media tours for 3 or 4 hours, on Wednesday before fight week. Most fighters are trying to get out as quickly as they can. And I understand because they're cutting weight and it's not fun and it's the same questions over and over again. But what people didn't say is the dedication that Floyd applied to in things that were not apparent. And so I think when Floyd said, okay, I need this amount of money, and the response was, well, here's X, Y, and Z that we need to maximize our opportunity to get that money, that made sense to him. A lot of other athletes skip that step. Say, okay, here's my dollar figure. I'm like, well, okay, well, we need this, and that to get there. And then it becomes more complex. It's like, well, you said you wanted to get here. I'm drawing you the map, and here's how we get there. But I think, it's not limited to athletes or fighters. I mean, we all want the instant gratification to some level. But I think, it looked far easier than it was. And that's probably one of the enduring legacies, inadvertently of Floyd Mayweather.
Everybody wants to be Money May, but nobody wants to be Pretty Boy Floyd.
Yeah, and nobody wants to look. There was a point in his career where he was, in nightclubs and he was, buying as many bottles and popping bottles. What most people didn't know, he wasn't drinking a drop of the alcohol. And there were many, many times, and we have footage to prove it. He went out in the car, put on his tennis shoes, and ran home 5, 6, 7 miles at 3 or 4 in the morning after being in the club. So, that's the things that people remember. Oh, like he was in a bottle buying war, like, going table for table, but they don't remember the fact that he ran home 7 miles after that.
Just going back to your kind of move over to Showtime and the focus that you really put on boxing and the fact that you made that a very, focal point of what you wanted to do there. Why was that?
I thought there was an opportunity there. There was an opportunity for us to really make noise, to take a slightly different tack. And it was a differentiator. For a premium network that wasn't going to be bidding on live sports, we wouldn't been able to do an exclusive contract with Patrick Mahomes, with Tom Brady, with Roger Federer, with Rafael Nadal. But we can be in the highest level of this sport, and that's a major advantage. And it was an advantage that we had a leg up on because as a premium network, it was a little bit easier to put combat sports on television because of the reticence and the reluctance of some sponsors to be involved. It's why largely it went away from ad-supported TV. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity. I took a hell of a risk. I took the job and moved to New York on 3 weeks' notice. Gave up my legal career, and there was no way that having done that I wasn't going to, use every lever imaginable and pursue every option to make it successful.
Was Mayweather-Pacquiao, we've kind of discussed it, was Mayweather-Pacquiao I don't want to say the peak, because you're still very much in the job. You're about to made a huge fight for this weekend. But that was such a huge event worldwide, and we've spoken already about culture and crossing over into people who don't care about sports, let alone boxing, and it reaching all of those people around the world. Can it get better than that? Can it ever get better than that?
I would like to think it would, but I think the realistic answer is no. I don't think we'll see that ever again in my lifetime. I don't think we'll see an athlete like Floyd, in my lifetime. He truly is a generational athlete. But I think what is most exciting to me, or most satisfying to me, is when I hear things like I was in Croatia a few weeks ago. At the start of June, and the boxing came up, and that topic of Mayweather-Pacquiao, and I'm dealing with a bunch of international people, mostly Croatians, not particularly combat sports fans, and there wasn't a person at the table who couldn't tell me exactly where they were, watching that fight. Now, I'd only been to Croatia one prior time in my life. I didn't know anything about it, but the fact that something that I had a hand in was literally a memorable experience for everyone, for a lot of people around the world, is something that, I take a lot of pride and satisfaction in. And I think part of this, boxing can be incredibly frustrating. It can be chaotic. It can be disorganized. It can be disappointing. It can be difficult to deal with the personalities. It can be a difficult business to be in. But there's one moment for me personally, I think for a lot of our team, that really reinforces why we do it. And that's when you walk into the arena on Saturday night, and it's filled to the rafters, and there's just a unique, palpable enthusiasm, a buzz, a certain adrenaline that is unlike any other sport. And to know that not just the 20,000 people in the arena, but hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people at home around the world are going to have a memorable experience because of something that you had a hand in. Like that makes it all worth it. Like when you get to that, I'll be pulling my hair out until fight night, but then on fight night, that adrenaline, and that's what provides the satisfaction, and that's what makes it very clear to all of us why we do it.
The way that I describe it to people, it's like a drug. Boxing, and you talk about quitting, you talk about how it's people will tell you, look, you need to stop, I can see, but then you get that hit, whether it's a big fight in Vegas or you watch something, you can watch an 8-rounder on an undercard and it just catches you, and then you go, that's why I put up with all of the shit.
Right. Yep. Or you've got, look, there's a freedom in this sport that can be frustrating, borders on chaos, maybe far over the border of chaos, but there's a unique freedom for the sport to embrace all variety of different personalities, and that's one of the most entertaining aspects of it. And I think that's something that we pride ourselves in, is when you go to a Spence-Crawford event, it's not going to feel like Davis Garcia. It's not going to feel like a Canelo event. It's not going to feel like a Charlo event. Each event has a personality of its own. Now, there are downsides to that. There are other organizations that make very cookie cutter events, and there are advantages to that. But I think you're sucking the vibrancy, the soul, the spirit out of the sport if you go to every event and it's cookie cutter marketing, cookie cutter music, cookie cutter presentation. And it's a disservice to the fighters, because a Canelo event should feel like Canelo. It should embrace all of that. And I think that's something that I think we also take particular pride and satisfaction is curating unique experiences, and the fact that no two fights really feel the same.
You mentioned Canelo there, bringing him back to Showtime, boxing Jamal Charlo at the end of September. How significant was that? There was the discussions, when was it, a year, 18 months ago or so, where it looked as though he could be on his way over to PBC and Showtime. Didn't quite work out then. It has now. Obviously a significant coup for Showtime Boxing to have Canelo Alvarez back.
Yeah, it's fantastic, but I think he's a smart businessman. He's gotten to the point where he understands the business, he understands his options, and he's made the decision up until now to sort of bounce around largely in free agency. And that's allowed him to collect some belts and maximize his opportunities. But, at this stage of his career, I think the talent pool with PBC and the opportunities that Showtime gives him are better than anywhere else. And I think that's why. And whether it's at 168 or in another weight class, I think the business opportunities and what he's experienced with us have showed him that, these are the best opportunities for opponents, and these are the best opportunities for big-time events.
Last quick couple from me. I do appreciate your time in a busy fight week. A couple of people that I'd like to discuss with you. Mm-hmm. Somebody that we don't hear an awful lot of, and certainly don't hear, certainly nothing from him, Al Haymon. Mm-hmm. Working with Al Haymon, kind of from our perspective, certainly on the other side of the pond, he is this kind of mythical character and somebody that, he's often heard, often straight after the fight by whoever's won the fight. But we don't know an awful lot about him. But you, of course, have worked closer with him over the years. What's it like working with Al Haymon?
Well, he's highly educated, really intelligent, really strategic. Obviously, Harvard undergrad, Harvard Biz School, started a very successful concert business, right out of school. And that, I think his... particularly in today's modern society where there's no shortage of people who want the spotlight, who want credit, who want acknowledgement publicly, he came up under various mentors in the music business, and his mantra in the music business was, the artist is the star, and if you're writing about the promoter, if you're writing about the manager, if you're writing about legal disputes, that's all ink that could be used in making the artist a bigger star. So somehow that philosophy has been sort of transmuted into something sort of sinister and somehow suspicious, when in fact, his entire mantra is like, why do I need to be there? Why do I need to be talked about? Why do I need to be, part of the press or giving interviews? I'm not the story. I'm a cog, and a large cog, but a cog in the machinery. I want people to be talking about my artist, and it's sort of the most sincere and devoted form of service. It's like, I don't want any credit for this. It's not like he tells them to thank them. They know that his motive is one particular thing, and that's to give boxers the opportunities that his brother never had, that avoid the kinds of ways that his brother was taken advantage of. And so that's his devotion to the sport, his motivation. And the fact that it has been twisted into something suspicious and sinister is sort of almost comical.
Where does that come from?
I think it comes from the fact that it's difficult to believe people can be that selfless, to say, look, I can be at the center of literally the biggest fights in history, but I don't want to talk about it. I don't want publicity or recognition for that. I think it is rare. But I think, I think, look, we can go further. I think there are certain elements of the boxing business that don't like the way he empowers fighters. I don't think they particularly like the way he has upended the existing power structure, and in terms of the flow of information and the access to things. I think there are a lot of people who would rather that someone who was sort of more consistent with the traditional way of doing things in a variety of different ways, and wasn't so sort of fighter-centric, because he certainly has opened the doors to fighters being educated and knowledgeable about their business affairs. And, he's not the only one, but I think there are plenty of people who would wish he hadn't empowered the fighters that he has.
A lot of this conversation has been kind of centered around people who have kind of taken, steps to shift and shape their respective industry, whether it's a Floyd Mayweather or an Al Haymon. How much more does boxing still have to go? How much does the structure that exists currently in boxing have to change in order to essentially survive and keep adapting and adjusting to a new era, I suppose?
Well, I have no doubt that the boxing is going to survive and intermittently thrive in its current structure. But boxing does need to significantly change in order to really reach its full potential. When we look at UFC or WWE, and you look at the valuations of those businesses, whether it's the $4 billion that they got acquired, or 8 or 10 or 12 or whatever valuation you want to use nowadays, there is nothing that you can say to convince me that boxing, properly done and properly organized, doesn't have an enterprise value of at least that much as well. There is literally nothing that those sports and those organizations have that boxing does not, short of organization and short of a more cohesive structure. Now, that's not a little thing, but there's a lot of areas I think we need. There needs to be a more cohesive structure for uniformity and officiating. I think it's a major problem. I think that comes from a need for consistency in training. I think we should adopt structures like every other major sport does. Every other major sport has officials that are graded both publicly and privately, and are rewarded or punished for their performance. And there is to some extent some of that, but not as consistently and not as openly as we need. Every other sport takes steps. Like, there'll be points of emphasis in every sport. This year, FIFA says, hey, we're going to improve VAR. We're going to change the way it is. And the NBA says, we're going to change the defensive rules to make offense better. There's no one looking out for boxing in that way. Certainly there are certain people. The WBA believes this. The WBC, has certain standards on safety and drug testing. But these are things that should be happening uniformly. So in terms of reaching its full potential, we've got a lot of work to do. I think it's all very doable, but there's a tremendous opportunity here. You look at the audience for the sport, multi-generational, multi-ethnic, as international as it gets. It is, a relatively affordable sport in an era where, from a TV licensing perspective, in an era where sports rights are out of control. So there is still a tremendous opportunity. I'm not saying that we have to do away with all the current business structures, but we are going to have to start working together a little bit more cohesively.
That kind of, I guess, the ideal structure, maybe naive structure of having a uniform, an oversight, like a FIFA or somebody like that in boxing. It's something that we've discussed countless times with various different people. Is that just a pipe dream? Is that something that can ever happen in boxing?
I think it can happen, and I think one of the reasons why I believe it can is because there's always changes in, there's always new blood coming into the sport, and whether it's sort of transition away from the king and Aram era to other forms of new blood and new people bringing new ideas in the sport, it's possibly. I think FIFA is a great example. I don't think it's necessarily has to be a one organization like a UFC or like a WWE, where there is one organization that literally administers, certainly not all the sport, but a good chunk of the sport. But I think a governing umbrella organization like a FIFA that works for the benefit of the sport in terms of uniformity in officiating, in scheduling, in rulemaking, in the improvement and marketing of the sport, I think that's exactly what we need.
Eddie Hearn. Now, there was once upon a time where you worked with Eddie Hearn, Anthony Joshua being a notable fighter that you worked with on Showtime a few years back. I think it's fair to say that your relationship is not as strong as it once was. Why is that?
There are a lot of theories. I've heard a lot of theories. I've heard a lot of theories for him. It candidly had nothing to do with Anthony Joshua. Had very little to do with anything I meant personally. I think it had to do with two things. Number one, just a general dishonesty and lack of professionalism in sort of the business dealings. Selling the Joshua Klitschko fight to HBO when we had a contract, for Anthony Joshua. And then it's sort of hard to remain collaborative and collegial with someone who you're working with one day, and then a few months later comes back and says, "But by the way, your business is shit. You guys are all idiots. You don't know what you're doing. I'm going to take over. You're going to fail. You're not going to survive. I'm smarter than you. I have a business model that's better than you." Now, all of those things might be true. It turned out not to be, but they could have been. But that does not make for a generally good working environment, a working relationship. Someone comes in and says, "Guess what? I'm putting you out of business. Your business model sucks, and it's over, and I've got more money, and I'm smarter than you, and you're not going to be able to compete." I don't think after telling you that, you're going to want to have lunch with me or drinks after dinner, and we're not having play dates with our kids. So, okay, you want to put me out of business? Okay, then we're competitors. And so it's nothing, nothing personal. I think he's a smart guy. I wish the best for him, but in terms of, he's made it very clear, his aim is to put us out of business. And as a competitive person, okay, challenge accepted.
I've spoke to Eddie about this on a couple of instances over the last few years, and I've kind of openly said to him that potentially that may not have been the best way of cracking the US market, should we say. Eddie is kind of typically of him, so well, that's how I am, that's how I operate, I want to go there and I'll be myself and I do this and X, Y and Z. Was that a mistake? Should he have gone about it differently? I know he's going to do things his own way. You're not here to give him advice or anything like that, or patronize anybody. But was that a mistake, entering the US market in such a braggadocious way? I've been on record to say to him that I felt it was. So
Well, look, I don't fault with that approach, that aggressiveness, that that desire to sort of be on top. But if you read Sun Tzu, you would not announce that ahead of time. You would have snuck quietly into the market, and before anyone knew what you were doing, you would have taken it over. But by putting everybody on notice, I just don't think it was a very smart thing to do. I think I agree with you. I don't think it was strategic. You're essentially putting everybody on notice of what exactly you're going to do months before you do it. I think it would have been far more effective to sneak in and quietly, start, maybe surprising people with that kind of stuff. I mean, that's the way I would have approached it.
Is there still a business relationship there? Or if not, is it salvageable? We've kind of spoken around the point in this about, relationships and how they can kind of have their peaks and valleys, as it were.
Yeah, no, at the end of the day, if there was a big fight to be done, then, no problem working with him whatsoever. Whatever happens with DAZN, if there's an opportunity, to work together, certainly wouldn't have any problem working with him in the past, or in the future. I mean,
would you work with Conor McGregor again?
I would. I might grit my teeth to some aspects of it. I did run into him after Davis Garcia. He made it clear this was, he was just trying to sell the fight. Not sure I completely believe him. If so, he's a far more convincing actor than I have ever given him credit for. But sure, there's, he's a fantastic personality. It was a successful event. I'd have no problem working with Conor again.
That period of time that you worked with him on that Floyd fight, it was so massive. I mean, I mentioned earlier on in the interview about seeing you at the London press conference, and particularly now in the UK, there's we struggle to put 4,000 or 5,000 people in places like that. That was packed out. There was people outside. Did you know at the time how big it was, and for him as well, what he's gone on to then achieve in the business world and things like that? Did you really know what you were getting yourself into?
I don't think anybody did. There are some, maybe Floyd believes he did, maybe Conor does, but I do not think anyone thought that we would be going 4 cities with sold out arenas just to hear a press conference. After LA, we got a sense of it, because it went LA, Toronto, Brooklyn, London. But I think really what opened his eyes is the massive response that we got in Toronto. And Toronto's been the hotbed of MMA. It wasn't that surprising, but it was literally filled to the gills, and couldn't have squeezed another person. And the same thing. There were it was just the wildest scene I'd ever seen. And then there was timing problems, and there were, people were late, and and the crowd was getting restless, and Drake is there, babysitting the crowd, thankfully, otherwise we would have had a riot. And then Conor McGregor decides to take the heel turn for whatever reason, and it turns into a whole other thing. And it just, at every stage, there was just a massive surprise. And, I think on a personal level, I doubt there'll be another opportunity where I can walk into arena and 17,000 people will boo me. So it was an experience. It was fun.
Yeah, it must be a nice person to call upon. Go and babysit the crowd, Drake. That's a pretty good one. I think, Stephen. I think that's all today. Well, it's certainly not all. There's we could go on for hours, but I do appreciate your time so close to such a massive event here in Las Vegas.
I enjoyed the
Saturday.
conversation. Yeah.
Well, thanks very much. As I said, I mentioned to you on the way up here, it's not quite Spence-Crawford or Mayweather-Pacquiao levels of waiting, but we've been waiting to get this done for a little while. So thanks very much for speaking to Boxing News, and all the best ahead of this weekend in Las Vegas for Spence-Crawford.
I appreciate your support of the event.